Hey everyone, welcome to the New Populist. I'm Dave Brown. If you're new to the channel, please like and subscribe. I am also on Twitter at the New Populist. You can go ahead and check that out. And I'm also the author of the book, or co-author of the book, Black and White: How the Left is Destroying the Dream of Martin Luther King and Our Founding Fathers. It is a right-leaning perspective on race relations, hopefully for you on the right. Conservatives, you find it refreshing and it gives you a different narrative than what you've heard from the media, from Black Lives Matter and Antifa. So go ahead and check it out. It's on Amazon, and there is a link in the description. Now, the topic of today: who controls the levers of power? Now, one thing we sort of found out over the last 4 years, or more specifically during the Trump administration, is that having somebody in the Oval Office is not enough. You need people, kind of like a chessboard, all around you to make sure that you can control the different levers of power to get things done. Now, leading up to the 2020 election, it became clear, especially as the coronavirus stuff started up and they started to change laws and introduce mail-in voting, that we didn't have the right people in the right places. Now, there was a time where we thought we did. We saw Republicans in office in certain places. We said, well, they're Republicans, they're going to do their job. And as we found out, that wasn't always the case. It's not about being a Democrat or Republican. It was more, do we have somebody who's part of the establishment or someone who is challenging the establishment? And we found the hard way that in many of those places where it was absolutely crucial, even if there was a Republican there, they weren't on our side. They were holding water for the powers that be, who we Trump supporters are fighting against. And that brings me to two articles I want to go through today. And one is from the Huffington Post, and this is a recent article where they're describing the landscape moving forward and this attempt by Trump and his supporters to subvert democracy. Now, I mentioned it in a previous video. There was an article in The Atlantic that was saying just this, that Trump was trying to institute a coup against the United States government in 2020 during the elections, and that he's trying to do the same thing in 2024. And now we have Huffington Post saying similar things. And of course, the Democrats in the Senate have dropped the Build Back Better bill, and they are now focusing on voting issues. And in my video yesterday, I pointed out, I think the strategy is that they're going to try to pass something during the Omicron peak in the United States in January. Right now, it's peaking in England, and as we've seen, it starts over in Europe, and then 3-4 weeks later, it hits the United States. So they're getting their surge right now in England. We're going to get our surge in January, and when there's maximum scaremongering from the media, when we have a bunch of cases, even if they're mild, even if the deaths aren't going up or hospitalizations, that's when they're going to scare everybody and say, "Hey, we got to pass this voting bill to make mail-in voting permanent going forward." And of course, if that happens, well, good luck to us. But back to these two articles. I want to go through them because it shows you that they realize that we're onto the game, that we're finally waking up and recognizing what's going on. And they don't like that. And now they're trying to strategize how to fight back against this. So finally, we're sort of getting into the game. They see this happening, and here's the response. So let's first check out this article from the Huffington Post. Democracy or doom: the race to stop the hijacking of 2024. So they're creating this scenario that if Donald Trump wins in 2024, democracy's over. Talk about being insane, but that's what the far left does. They're radicals, they're insane, and they'll say anything pretty much. But what they're pointing out, and it mentions here in the subtitle, Secretary of State contest are in the 2022 spotlight as Trump continues to undermine American democracy. None may be bigger than Georgia. So they're outlining or pointing to the Secretary of State as being a very important position in determining how elections unfold. Now they point to Georgia, and we found out, unfortunately, that the Georgia Secretary of State was. I'm not going to say that he was necessarily corrupt, but he was weak, and that's all it takes for the establishment and the media to steamroll somebody. If they sense weakness there, you're already finished. So, but what Huffington Post is recognizing here is that it's not just about the presidency, it's about the different levels of power at the local and state levels that can determine outcomes that affect the entire nation. And of course, in this context, we're talking about voting. A Secretary of State in one state has an immense, a lot of power, and that's where we're finally catching up. And this last year, we've seen some voting laws change, new legislation at the state level, and that is pissing off Democrats. And now they're trying to fight back by getting their people in the right position. So now we're playing this little match of chess. We're both recognizing what the board is, and we're trying to get our pieces in the right position. But let's continue in this article. In most election cycles, you probably never learn Biden's name. But next year, the Georgia state legislator, who's now running for Secretary of State, will be one of just a handful of people in the world who can ensure America has a free and fair presidential election in 2024. Former President Donald Trump and much of the Republican Party have declared open war on American democracy, maneuvering to overturn any results that are unfavorable to them, just as they unsuccessfully attempted in 2020. In particular, the former president and his allies have launched an all-out effort to take over the machinery of the U.S. electoral system by installing allies in positions of power at the state and local levels. So they just pretty much repeated what I just said earlier, that we're recognizing now that we need people at the local and state levels to protect our elections. And depending on which side you fall on, it's either protecting or subverting. And that's the game here. Obviously, this is Huffington Post. So if we're doing it, we're subverting democracy. And actually, let me continue here for 1 second. That certainly happened in Georgia last fall. After now President Joe Biden was declared the winner in the state, Trump and his allies tried to sway virtually every state official who could potentially change the result. They pushed for an audit of votes in Cobb County, which didn't turn up any irregularities. Trump personally lobbied the Republican governor, and when that didn't work, the Republican Secretary of State. The Trump Department of Justice cajoled and threatened the U.S. attorney in an attempt to get him to embrace false election theft claims. He resigned instead. So this is something that's important here. And unfortunately, I think this wasn't the best move to, at this point in time, try to challenge the election after, quote unquote, the election results were in. And it's not because I don't think there was malfeasance. That's not it. And not because I don't want Trump to fight or Trump supporters to fight. My point is, it was already too late. We were out of position. And to try to, at that point, go, oh, wait a second, something's going on here, then what are we going to do about it? It's too late. This should have happened months before. We saw in Pennsylvania, they were changing laws. It went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, of course, as we know, is not 6-3 Republican or conservative. It's really 4-4. And Roberts is not really a conservative, and Kavanaugh, who knows? Same thing with Amy Coney Barrett. There's only really 3 for sure conservatives on the Supreme Court. But anyway, that was booted, and it was very clear that Pennsylvania was breaking election laws and violating the Constitution by unilaterally doing it around the state legislature. So we recognize in, I guess, September, October 2020, what was going on, and it was too little, too late, and of course, the Supreme Court wasn't on our side. But a point being, by the time we actually realized what was going on, it was already too late. And so now it's December 2020. All the votes are counted, and now we're trying to go back and go, wait a second, I know something's wrong here. I can't necessarily prove it right now, but I just know something's off. And I think that's the problem. We knew something was wrong, but we didn't have them dead to rights. And unfortunately, because we didn't have that, and because we don't control the media, it was too late. And basically, everything we do after that amounts to us throwing a hissy fit. And that's how it came off. Then we have January 6th, and now we've given the media and the Democrats every opportunity to create propaganda against us and to try to cast all Trump supporters as being insurrectionists, white supremacists, you name it. So I think we put ourselves out of position there, and when we try to fight back, it was a little too late. And fortunately, now we're trying to correct that moving forward to 2024. But let's continue with this article. As a possible last resort, a publicist for Kanye West showed up at the home of a Georgia election worker who was the subject of viral election theft conspiracy theories and attempted to frighten her into validating them. West was a close ally of Trump, though it was not clear who his publicist put his publicist up to this grim task. It was a methodical attempt to conduct a coup in Georgia. They weren't trying to find the weakest link in the chain of they were trying to find the weakest link in the chain of Democratic transfer to break it, MSNBC's Chris Hayes said last week. And they kept trying each different link in that chain. Who cares about Chris Hayes? He's a establishment goon. He's a arm of Western intelligence, CIA. He carries water for the establishment and for the intelligence services. So let's just move on from him. He's an idiot. It continues here. Now they're trying it via the ballot box. Rep. Jody Hice is running for Secretary of State after voting twice in Congress last year to contest the presidential election results. He has received Trump's endorsement, and if he wins, will control much of the election machinery in the state. And that's what they're worried about. We have a Trump ally who will be in a position to, as they say here, control much of the election machinery in the state. Let's continue. An extremist in every swing state. Trump and the GOP's all-out push for a partisan takeover of the country's election machinery also terrifies independent observers who are already concerned about the immediate threat of American democracy. A survey released Thursday by Brightline Watch, an academic collective that began polling experts on the state of U.S. democracy in 2017, found that Secretary of State candidates like Hice are among the biggest current concerns. Let me actually say what happens here. A survey released by Thursday by Brightline Watch is academic collective. This means these are establishment, Democrat-leaning people who are going to cherry pick what exactly they're finding and paint the narrative that they want to paint. And polling experts on the state of U.S. democracy in 2017. Who exactly are these experts? And how do you poll on the state of democracy? It's so subjective, and that's where it's just, I think, it's obviously just nonsense. Let's continue. Among the experts, 97% rated election skepticism from Secretary of State candidates as mostly abnormal or abnormal in the survey, while 96% rated it mostly important or important. The highest concern levels on Brightline Watch's scale, that made such attacks the first major concern to emerge around the 2022 or 2024 elections, generating nearly as much fear among experts as the Capitol insurrection and the effort to overturn the 2020 election results. So they are zoning on the fact that the Secretary of State positions are all important. And now the Democrats and Huffington Post here, they're trying to rally to push as much money and effort. We know that Source does this with the DAs. Now they realize the Secretary of State positions, this is where their focus has to be, so they can control the mechanisms of power. Let's keep going. Trump and the GOP's effort to overturn the results of the 2020 election were far more sophisticated than they appeared at the time, as the recent revelations from Congress's January 6th Select Committee have made clear. But Trump world's focus on Secretary of State races now is part of another total war on the country's electoral system. That means to ensure no such post-election coup is necessary next time, or if it is necessary, that it works. So, the article in the Atlantic says that if Trump wins in 2024, it will be because he subverted democracy and changed laws and manipulated laws in order for him to win. So, damned if he do, damned if he doesn't. Let's go on. Heiss or a similar lawmaker could close polling locations, implement more restrictive rules for how to process and count absentee ballots, and empower election skeptical local officials to take their own aggressive actions. Many of the GOP's new election laws, meanwhile, criminalize strategies local election officials used last year to expand voting options during the coronavirus pandemic. So they characterize it here as expanding voting options. And so the GOP is criminalizing that. No, we're not criminalizing that. We're saying this was too expansive. This was done at the last second. This is not secure. You can't do this. And again, this is why this new national legislation by the Senate that they're trying to push forward is so important, because they want to, again, make those mail-in voting options legal at the national level. And there's going to be a whole backlog of court challenges to what the Congress can do as far as telling the states to do certain things as far as voting. Obviously, each state has their own voting procedures, and what power the Congress has at the national level to dictate what they can do will be a issue that will go to the courts. A secretary that applies the strictest possible interpretation of those laws could thwart officials' ability to enact policies that make it easier for voters to cast ballots, especially in heavily populated areas where elections tend to be more complex and where the electorate is most often disproportionately Black, Latino, and Democratic. So that's normal stuff there. They always point to Democrats or people of color being victims, and that's the usual Democrat line there. Are Democrats doing enough? Nationally, Democrats have struggled to formulate a response to Trump and the GOP's attempt to curb voting rights and undermine the nation's democracy. And their inability to push major voting rights and electoral reform bills through the Senate has left activists, organizers, and many state lawmakers concerned that party leaders don't realize the urgency of the moment or aren't willing to meet it. So again, we're back to this issue where they're pushing hard right now, and they're changing the narrative, and they said they're dropping the whole Build Back Better. Don't worry about inflation. Don't worry about that. Let's focus on voting, because that's really going to set everything up for the next several years to come. So it's so important, and they realize that, and that's where they're retraining their efforts. Next slide. Okay, well, so that's the Huffington Post article. See how they characterize an effort by Republicans and by the GOP to change voting laws, which is legal at the state level, to have their people run for office openly. We're not doing anything behind the scenes. We're doing it openly, and that's being characterized as an assault on democracy. Now, let's juxtapose that article to this Time article that came out in February of this year. And it's interesting because they too took actions before the election in 2020, but they characterized it as being benevolent, despite the fact that even in the title here, they talk about a shadow campaign. Now, it makes you think of the Washington Post's motto, democracy dies in darkness. So here they are in the shadows, trying to save, quote unquote, save the 2020 election. And so the title here is The Secret History of the Shadow Campaign That Saved the 2020 Election. And this really exposes their hypocrisy and the fact that they are doing things themselves. And here it's not transparent. They're doing it, away from the spotlight to quote unquote save the 2020 election. So let's go into this article a little bit and see what they say. A weird thing happened right after the November 3rd election. Nothing. The nation was braced for chaos. Liberal groups had vowed to take to the streets, planning hundreds of protests across the country. Right-wing militias were girding for battle. In a poll before Election Day, 75% of Americans voiced concern about violence. Let's stop right there. The left was planning to protest. There were not right-wing militias girding for battle. I mean, that's with 10 people from the Proud Boys. That's okay. That's nonsense. They want to make it seem like that we were just as part of this violence as the left is. No. The left was going to go to the streets. We weren't. But of course, Biden wins. Left stands down. Instead, a nary quiet descended. As President Trump refused to concede, the response was not mass action but crickets. When media organizations called the race for Joe Biden on November 7th, jubilation broke out instead as people thronged cities across the U.S. to celebrate the democratic process that resulted in Trump's ouster. Let's continue. A second odd thing happened amid Trump's attempt to reverse the result. Corporate America turned on him. Hundreds of major business leaders, many of whom had backed Trump's candidacy and supported his policies, called on him to concede. To the president, something felt amiss. It was all very strange, very, very strange, Trump said on December 2nd. Within days after the election, we witnessed an orchestrated effort to anoint the winner, even while many key states were still being counted. In a way, Trump was right. Now, let's stop right there. So, as I said earlier, we knew something funky was going on. There was the Attorney General for Pennsylvania who said, when all the votes are counted, and this is before the election, Trump's going to lose. And he's the Attorney General of the state. He was called out by Republicans and conservatives going, hey, you're a state official. It seems like you're sort of predetermining the results of this election. But of course, he's a Democrat, so no one cared. And he said, no, screw you guys, whatever. And so we felt something was off. We saw the 3 a.m. Ballot, they stopped counting. We saw the thing in Georgia with the broken pipe. So they stopped counting because a toilet overflowed somewhere in the area they were counting. It was something ridiculous, and everybody who saw it that night knows that something was off. And so, as Trump pointed out here, he knew something was off. So let's continue. There was a conspiracy unfolding behind the scenes, one that both curtailed the protest and coordinated the resistance from CEOs. Both surprises were the result of an informal alliance between left-wing activists and business titans. The pact was formalized in a terse, little-noticed joint statement of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and AFL-CIO published on Election Day. Both sides would come to see it as a sort of implicit bargain inspired by the summer's massive, sometimes destructive racial justice protests, in which the forces of labor came together with the forces of capital to keep the peace and oppose Trump's assault on democracy. Sounds a little more like fascism to me and coming together to stop an assault on democracy, but more on that. It continues. The handshake between business and labor was just one component of a vast cross-partisan campaign to protect the election, an extraordinary shadow effort dedicated not to winning the vote, but to ensuring it would be fair and free, credible, and uncorrupted. For more than a year, a loosely organized coalition of operatives scrambled to shore up America's institutions as they came under simultaneous attack from a remorseless pandemic and an autocratically inclined president. Through much of this activity took place on the left, it was separate from the Biden campaign and crossed ideological lines, with crucial contributions by nonpartisans and conservative actors. The scenario the shadow campaigners were desperate to stop was not a Trump victory. It was an election so calamitous that no result could be discerned at all, a failure of the central act of democratic self-governance that has been the hallmark of America since its founding. Now, they talk about it wasn't just left wing; it was cross partisan. And anytime they bring up cross partisan Democrats and Republicans, let's replace those with this: establishment versus non-establishment. All those people that were involved in that were part of the establishment. Just because you're Republican doesn't mean you're on our side. Um, so they always try to do that to claim that there's some sort of bipartisan effort. And we see this in the Senate where they have 50 Democrat senators, and then there's 4 Republican senators. They call it bipartisan, but then of course we know that these four Republican senators aren't worth a damn, and they are part of the establishment and the machine. And the fact that the Republicans means very little. So I hate when they say that. And here again, we have business and government, nonprofit, all coming together. Any sort of coordinated effort like that should make you concerned. And as the article says, this is all done in the shadows. They weren't being transparent about this. They were teaming together. But let's continue. Their work touched every aspect of the election. They got states to change voting systems and laws and help secure hundreds of millions in public and private funding. They fended off voter suppression lawsuits, recruited armies of poll workers, and got millions of people to vote by mail for the first time. They successfully pressured social media companies to take a harder line against disinformation and use data-driven strategies to fight viral smears. They executed national public awareness campaigns that helped Americans understand how the vote count would unfold over days or weeks, preventing Trump conspiracy theories and false claims of. Let me just stop there for a second. But notice that they said here, they got states to change their laws, change voting systems. And what the hell does that mean? Why is the secret cabal, who is not being transparent, getting states to change their voting systems? And they're recruiting armies of poll workers. They're trying to get people to vote by mail. They're teaming up with Twitter, with Facebook to take a hard line against disinformation. Remember the Hunter Biden laptop? That was suppressed. Was that disinformation? As it turns out, it was 100% real. So they weren't taking a hard line against disinformation. They were censoring things that was damaging to the Biden campaign. And so they're casting themselves as being the heroes here in the shadows, without transparency, changing voting systems, suppressing speech. But they are the good guys. And again, it's all about narrative. If whoever controls the narrative can control who the good guys and the bad guys are. So here they are in the Huffington Post article attacking us for openly having people run for Secretary of State, for having state legislatures change laws to in our position to protect voting. And here they are in this Time article back in February admitting that they were working in secret to change voting systems, to get mail voting done, and to suppress disinformation, or as we call it, free speech. So we're the good guys, or they're the good guys, and we're the bad guys. More nonsense. And this is when, again, you take these two articles and you look at what they're doing and what their claim is happening, and you realize it's just a game for them. They do so. Whatever they accuse you of, they're doing themselves, and that's what we learned about the left over the last several years. And we probably should have known it earlier as well. I think this might be the last slide here. The untold story of the election is that thousands of people of both parties who accomplished the triumph of American democracy at its very foundation, says Norm Eisman, a prominent lawyer and former Obama administration official who recruited Republicans and Democrats to the board of the Voter Protection Program. Again, a former Obama official, so I think that says a lot, recruiting Republicans and Democrats, or as I said earlier, people who are part of the establishment, and thousands of people from both parties No, these were thousands of establishment people making sure Donald Trump didn't become president of the United States. And so now we're wise to this game. We're paying attention, levers of power, making sure you have your people in the right position. And if you're on their side, you accuse us of cheating and malfeasance and of trying to subvert democracy. And if you're on our side, we go, no, we're trying to make sure that we have a secure voting system and we don't have millions of votes going out in the mail where the U.S. Postal Service becomes a prominent part of the voting system. Where's the chain of custody? When you have thousands or tens of thousands of postal workers handling bags of ballots, so it's all subjective. And in the game of politics, it's funny because if whoever controls most of the media and he controls the broadcast news, they control the narrative, and that's where we have that disadvantage. We don't control the mainstream media; they do. So that's their advantage, and they're going to work overtime to make sure any inroads we make in trying to make sure we have secure elections, that we have we don't have this mass mail-in ballots and mail-in voting and stuff. They're going to cast that as an attack on democracy, attack on minorities and sick people who know they might get coronavirus if they go to the voting booths, so they need to stay home and vote. So this is all a information war. I hope I've aptly shown you how you have these two articles, and what they do in secret and private is good, and what we do openly, which is following the laws, making laws through the state legislatures, and running for Secretary of State, all of a sudden we're subverting democracy. So that's the game going forward. We'll see how this unfolds. It's going to be interesting because it seems like no matter what happens in 2024, whoever wins, the other side is going to claim that democracy was subverted and that the election was fraudulent. And I wonder long term how this can hold up if we're not going to have some sort of huge fracture in our society bigger than it is now. Because if going forward, if every election is as contentious as it was in 2020 and gets even more so, we're going to have big problems coming up. And it's going to be, at the very least, very interesting to see what happens. So I guess we'll all stay tuned, and we'll see how this all unfolds. And hopefully our country does not rip into 1,000 pieces. And there's also the added component of inflation, coronavirus. There's a lot of variables out there that could change what happens and how things proceed in the future. So keep an eye out. Well, that's it for now. Again, if you're new to this channel, please like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.